Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Sporting Fan Podcast. It's been a while, but I want to talk about something that has come as a bit of a shock, and that is Eddie Jones taking over as Wallabies coach from Dave Rennie. This has come a bit of a shock, as basically everyone expected Dave Rennie to stay on as Wallabies coach to at least the end of the World Cup later this year. It's been a bit of a rough few years. So, I'm just going to quickly give my opinions on it, because this is something that has really could have a lot of ramifications for Australian rugby. So basically, like I said, Eddie Jones has taken over, and it's kind of a back to the future, because of course Eddie Jones has coached the Wallabies previously. He took them to the 2003 World Cup final, and so the thinking is that, hopefully he can do it again. Personally, I think it could be could go either ways. I'll just quickly speak about Dave Rennie though. He basically was appointed in after the 2019 World Cup. Australia reached the quarterfinals, and they got beaten by England, who was actually coached by Eddie Jones, funnily enough. Australia performed pretty poorly at that World Cup, to be honest. They should have beaten Wales. There was in my opinion, poor refereeing led to that loss, because the Wallabies just went down in that game, and then they had two absolutely shit-house calls that ended up costing them the game. But yeah, so they would have been on the other side of the pool. So you never know, they may have made even the semi-finals instead of the quarterfinals. But yeah, they got knocked out by England in the quarterfinals, and then the previous coach, Michael Cheika, got axed as coach. I think he got stood down, but he was going to get axed anyway. So they offered Dave Rennie the coaching role. So he had a very good record at domestic level. He'd won Super Rugby titles. He had a lot of success in Europe. So the Wallabies thought, we need to change of direction. And they looked for the best person on the market, who they thought was the best person on the market, which every sporting organisation should do. They should look at who the best person on the market is. And they thought, okay, let's bring him in and see how he goes. And a lot of people didn't give him much of a chance, because, the Wallabies seem to usually do the best when they're coached by an Australian. And, they had Robbie Deans in the past, of course, who coached the Crusaders, and then that didn't go overly well, and they ended up performing poorly in that walk. I wouldn't say the Wallabies performed poorly, it's just not as well as they would have hoped. And he ended up getting axed for Michael Cheika, and then Michael Cheika took him to the 2015 World Cup final. But yeah, I just think, he came in with a whole Dave Rennie came in with a lot of promise. He came in, a lot of people thought he was going to change a lot of things. But then for whatever reason, it didn't work. I've got my own theories why it didn't work, which I'll go into. Both because of some of his policies, I think, didn't work. Like for example, he only had a 38% win record for the Wallabies in the 3 years that he was coach. one of the main reasons I think he failed was because he was never, he didn't keep the same players 2 weeks in a row, so the team wasn't really ever building combinations. Like, you look at the successful teams like, England over the last few years, well, as much as they didn't have a good year last year, but, England, France, Ireland, the All Blacks over like 100 years, the Springbok. These teams that have been dominant for so long, and when the Wallabies were actually, when the Wallabies were performing, the majority of the team was like the bulk of the team was the same every week. Like, obviously, you need to have the occasional change where, just in case someone gets injured, you want to have the occasional week where you put a bloke on the bench, might put a mainstay on the bench, and you bring another player in, or you bring that new player off the bench and you just give them a bit of experience, and so that if ever the frontline bloke does get hurt, you have experienced players. So I could understand his thinking that why he wanted to do it, but I just think the way he went about it was stupid, because every single week, half the team would more than half the team would change from one week to another, even if they won. And people go, oh well, these blokes play at Super Rugby. It's just together at Super Rugby level. It's just like, well, not all of them do. Like, it's all good if you have 10 blokes that play Super Rugby together every week, but there's an extra 13 blokes that wouldn't play with those blokes every week, and they need to build combinations. And so it was just getting to the stage where blokes were getting chopped and changed every week. Looked like blokes were working, didn't care. I think the best way to put it is they didn't look like they cared, because they just go, well, I'm not going to be here next week. Like, it's just, when they just think, I'm not going to be playing next week, even if they had a game where they scored 3 tries and, set up another 2 or 3, and they had bloody 2 line out, if they're, for example, if they're a line out, if they're in the forward, they had 3 line-out steals and had 5 turnovers. They know they weren't going to get, unless they're Michael Hooper, they know that they weren't going to get picked the next following week. And people were just like, well, what's the point? And, so it was getting to the stage where, you need to be putting, you need to have your best 23 playing, that's available. And so I think that was a major thing that was that went wrong. Some people are saying that some of the arguments were saying, well, that I've seen through social media and whatnot, that he wasn't actually a lot of the brains behind his success at domestic level. It was actually his assistants, and when he moved away from his assistant coaches at domestic level, that's when that's why Australia didn't do so well, because his assistants were really the brains and he was just the face of it. Whether that's true or not, I don't really know. Look, there could be an element of truth to that. It is a strong possibility, because look at what has happened with the All Blacks. 2020 and 2021 and the first half of 2022, they were very, very poor, the All Blacks. It was probably, the worst. Well, it was probably the worst the All Blacks have performed since. Well, probably no. Well, it is the worst the All Blacks have ever performed. They had never lost 5 games in a row. They, they had never lost to Ireland at home. Now they have. They never had lost. I don't think they had ever lost a series to Ireland. Now they had. And that series was also at home. They had never lost a series to Ireland, and they lost. It was the first time they ever lost, and it was at home. So that just destroyed a lot of faith in the coaching staff, and they eventually they kept backing the head coach, and then they axed the assistants. And while the All Blacks weren't great, there was a massive improvement in them. They brought in a couple of blokes. One was a Crusaders assistant coach. I can picture his face. I'm not 100% sure what his name is, but he came in and the two new assistants came in, and they were performing a lot better. So a lot of people are saying, well, maybe they should have. Dave Rennie should have changed his assistants earlier, maybe after 2021, after they didn't have the best of times that year, and they should have brought in a new coach where they could have just, started afresh. He didn't do that. Did it cost him his job? We'll never know. Another policy which is a bit more on... I think he actually tried to change it, so I think this is more of a rugby Australia problem rather than his problem. They basically, unless with the Ghetto law, I think you had to play 60 tests before you could get selected from an overseas team. You had to play in Australia until you play 60 tests. If you don't play 60 tests, if you say you play, even if you had played 59, and then you went overseas, you couldn't then play for the Wallabies. And then they softened it up a bit where they were picking blokes from overseas, but a lot of blokes were, a lot of Australia's best players play overseas now. Like Mariki Korobidi plays in Japan. Blokes like, I know a lot of people will laugh at me saying this, but because I know a lot of people think he's not the best player, but I think he's great second rowers. Rory Arnold. You just go through the number of great players that play overseas for Australia, and they can't get picked simply because they play overseas. And if you go back 20 years ago, when Eddie Jones was coach, and when the Australians made the World Cup final in 2003, and as much as they lost that, which I'll speak a bit when I go into speak about Eddie Jones. Australia had that core players. They had those very good players still at home. So even if you had a top quality player, like a world class player, that went over to Europe, or they went not so much Japan back then, but if up until 20 years ago, and even up to about 12 or 13 years ago, like if those players went overseas, they could have just said, well, fine, piss off, we'll just get somebody else. But then around 2010, 2011, after that, I think it would have been about after the, it was starting to really show after the 2011 World Cup. And yes, I know the Wallabies would go on to make the World Cup final in 2015, but a lot of the secondary, they weren't able to really fill a lot of positions if the top bloke got injured. And as time has gone on, it's just become really exposed. Like, they got away with it at 15 by making the final, but it really showed in the last World Cup in 2019 that not having the secondary players come up and not picking those players that are overseas, it really affected Australia. And the argument, and I can understand the argument that Rugby Australia has. The argument is, if we just say we will still pick you from overseas, it ruins the Super Rugby. It will weaken rugby even more in Australia. If you don't pick players, if you allow players to go overseas, and pick them from over there, because they say, well, it'll weaken it because then, with the Super Rugby teams where it runs early in the year, obviously, teams will kids will just see them getting pumped every week by New Zealand teams, and then they just think they're losers, and then they will go to rugby league, and but if they see that the Wallabies are at least winning, more people will come, and I think eventually it will change. It's a hard one simply because rugby doesn't have any money. So, having that thread over it, like saying, I want you to stay, there's still that, they can still use that leverage. Because it's basically the only leverage that rugby in this country still has. So whether they will change that, I don't know, but, it's a possibility that it could, but they need to find a balance where they had to pick, maybe if they, find a medium, say like, oh, you had to pick this amount of players from Australia and, only this amount of players from overseas, maybe that's a possibility, instead of having, all the players playing overseas, that's a possibility as well. With Eddie Jones, I can see why they have a point at him, because he has had a lot of success over a long period. He's been coached for 20-odd years now, been an international coach for over 20 years, and he's nearly always basically always had success. You very rarely see him have a failure, and if he do, it's for a short period of time. The argument here is that what a lot of people, I think I actually saw that he had an 82% win record at the World Cup, so he's got to, that just reinforces a point he's had a lot of success. The argument against him is that, there's two main arguments. He's, the last year he got sacked by England. And that was mainly because he had only won 5 out of 12 games. He had done basically the similar kind of thing that Dave Rennie did. He kept chopping and changing plays from what I hear, as much as, I didn't watch, but judging by what I saw, comments I saw, he was changing teams regularly. There was just a lot of things that he basically, what people were criticizing Dave Rennie for, he was doing with England. So it's a lot harder to. It's a bit weird that they asked sack one coach to bring in a coach that's just been. They sack a coach with poor performance to bring in a coach who had just been sacked elsewhere for poor performance. So that's the first point that I want to make. So, as much as Eddie Jones did have a lot of success with England, obviously, he won Six Nations with them and he's took them to the World Cup final. But that just leads me into my next point. He took them to the 2019 World Cup, right? It was the second time he's taken them to he's coached a team. Like I said, was saying earlier, he coached Australia to the World Cup final in 2003. Yet he lost. He lost that. England lost that final, and everyone goes, "Well, at least they made it." But he is the only coach to coach a team to 2 World Cup finals and lose both. He's also the only coach to have a team at the World Cup win 3 pool games, being Japan in 2015. They won 3 pool games and lost. They did not make the final. No other team in Rugby World Cup history has won 3 games and not made the quarterfinals. And the other thing that he did is he is still, to this day, the only coach to take a Southern Hemisphere, one of the big three Southern Hemisphere teams, being Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. He's the only person to take one of them to a World Cup final and lose to a Northern Hemisphere team, which is 03. Because if you look at, and then people say, oh, but, other Southern Hemisphere teams have gone to the final and lost. Like, look at, New Zealand in 95, they lost to South Africa. You even mentioned, 2015, Australia made that final and lost. Well, but look who they lost to. They lost, in 95, South Africa beat New Zealand. It was a Southern Hemisphere team beating a Southern Hemisphere team. 2015, New Zealand beat Australia. Again, a Southern Hemisphere team beating a Southern Hemisphere team. So, yes, as much as other Southern Hemisphere teams have made the final and lost, they remain the only. He remains the only coach of a team to lose, a Southern Hemisphere team to lose against a Northern Hemisphere team. Because obviously all other 8 World Cups have been won by either Australia, New Zealand, or South Africa. And and Australia remains the only one of the big. They were the first of the big 3 to win 2 World Cups. Now they're the only one not to win 3. So since since '99 when Australia last won it, South Africa and New Zealand both have won 2 each. With South Africa winning winning it in 07 and the last one in 19. And of course, New Zealand won it back to becoming the first team to win back-to-back in 11 and 15. See, Australia could have made history on many fronts. They could have been the first of 3 World Cup championship wins, and they could have been the first one to win back-to-back, being 99 and 03. But of course they failed that. So this is the argument with Eddie Jones. I just see, and I know a lot of who will be asking, well, what's your opinion on it? My opinion is that Dave Rennie should have been allowed to see it through to the World Cup at the end of the year. If he failed, he failed. If he succeeded, he succeeded. Like. See, the other argument was that, if Eddie Jones, wasn't signed by the Wallabies, he would have been snapped up by somebody else. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. That could be, always be a question that, we'll, we can never, we always we'll live in the what if universe. Would someone have picked him up? Would he have been successful? What would have happened? Who knows? People will say he's got, he was basically the reason why Japan is where it's at in their rugby now. Because of course, in 2011 they got absolutely annihilated by New Zealand in the pool stages at the World Cup in 2011 in New Zealand. They lost something like 87-7 to the All Blacks. And then 4 years later in 2015, as much as they didn't make the finals, they beat the Springbok, which nobody saw coming. And that was one of the best, in my opinion, one of the best games, if not the best pool game in Rugby World Cup history. So certainly the biggest upset in Rugby World Cup history. And, of course, Japan made the quarters the last time. So would they have done it without him putting the groundwork in? Who knows? But, Eddie Jones also... One thing I will say with Eddie Jones, he still has the mentality of the early 2000s. He thinks, I'm going to poach a lot of the best rugby league talent. Because a lot of them... And I can see where he's coming from, because a lot of the top league players came from union backgrounds. Like, of course, Joseph Sawali went to King's, which is a rugby school. Angus Crichton went to Scots, which is a rugby school, and there's a lot of other rugby union And there's Cam Murray who went to Newington again, a rugby school. So there are a lot of players out there that are rugby union juniors that are now playing rugby league, and he wants to poach them back. There's one main difference, though, from when he was coach in the early 2000s to now, and that's money. Everything revolves around the money in sport. And there's one major problem that he hasn't looked into. Rugby in this country has no... Like, in Australia, it does not have anywhere near the money that it used to when he was last coach. When he was coach last time, because the rugby had been amateur for up until the mid-90s, and they had a monster TV rights deal, they were riding high. They had they were still getting massive crowds at the Super Rugby. They were getting over 30,000 all the time at the Super Rugby games, especially in Sydney. They had a fat sum of money, right? They were still riding high. They were riding high for like 10 to 15 years afterwards. But after the rugby went professional in '96, and he was coach of Australia until about 2005. So it's just like, they had all that money, and they were just like, throwing it away like it was confetti, and that's how they were able to get a lot of the top talent from league in the late 90s, early 2000s was because because they could pay more than the league. Like, yes, obviously league was coming out of the Super League but they put in a salary cap where a lot of the players couldn't get paid the massive money, whereas rugby in Australia had no salary cap, and because they had so much money, they could poach all the top players. Where you could see like players like Lottie Kiri, Wendell Saylor, Matt Rogers. These guys came over, and these guys, very talented players, but they could probably only earn $450,000, $500,000 at a maximum, which again is a great salary, but they could really only cap out at that, and there was only a small number of players that were earning even $600,000, let alone there was a few more earning $500,000, but as wingers they probably would have only Matt Rogers was in the centres and that. And Lottie Kiri and Wendell Taylor on the wing, they could probably only earn, wingers were paid, well, they still are paid peanuts. They were probably only getting 300, they'd be getting paid $300,000 a year, 400 at the tops. Whereas rugby would have offered them, $650,000 to $700,000. They're probably getting offered $300,000 more, minimum $200,000 more than what they were getting in league. And so, of course, that, you're training at the same facilities, or in Lottie Kiri's case, he had to move down to Sydney. But, you're earning a lot. You were earning a lot more back then, than what you were in league. So it's it's pretty hard to say, well, I'm doing practically the same job as much as I'm going to a completely different code where all the rules are different, everything's different. But I'm getting a hell of a lot, and that's a hell of a lot more to turn down. It's not going from of course, if there's the American sports, $200,000 to them is nothing when you're getting paid, several $1 million a year. But when you're only in the hundreds of thousands and someone's offering you hundreds of thousands of dollars more, people will go. But the difference now is that, rugby unions only can afford to pay these guys what the league was paying them back 15 years ago. They only can pay them, $550 to $600, whereas, your average player in the league, solid first graders these days are getting that. the plays that he wants, like plays like Sawali and Angus and that, like guys like Angus Crichton, Cameron Murray, like these guys are the guys that he wants. They're gonna be like Angus Crichton would be on like 750. Joseph Sawali, I know he's not pronounced. I know he doesn't pronounce it Sawali now, so I'm sorry for the pronounce your name, but he's going to be earning a lot more. Like, you have to be earning something more than what the opposition is. Because the thing is, if you say, if you're earning paying them $200,000 less, they're just going to say, see you later. And, I don't think Eddie Jones is quite, realised that yet. Like, he either has to get fringe first graders, which you don't really want at that elite level. You want to have the best players coming over, like the big names. Like, they had, probably the last one that rugby union really got was Israel Folau, and they haven't really had a top player since come to union, and they players just won't come because they can earn more money in league, and if they're earning $800,000, you need to be offering a minimum $950 to $1 million a year. I just think Eddie Jones hasn't really grasped that yet, and a lot of players don't want to go to union. And again, this will lead me into my next point now. This is a problem that rugby is, and I think one of the big problems why they're not keeping these guys in the game when they're rugby union juniors is because of Rugby Australia. Like, Rugby Australia has severe fundamental problems. The problems they have are so long. Like, they basically, when I was at university and I did sports management, they told us about it. They use the escalator model, right? And basically, and basically what the escalator model is who's on the escalator. And people, and I'll quickly explain it. Basically, if you're at the bottom of the escalator, you've got basically no interest in the game, don't understand the game, you've got, nothing. At the top of the escalators are your hardcore, fan of the sport to the bone. They're likely never going. The chances of them leaving is highly unlikely. Them going down. But then in between those 2 points is everyone else, right? So the first concept is obviously getting people on the bus, right? You want people on this bus, on the escalator, so at least they're watching occasionally. And so you have to have it where you're at least getting some more people on the escalator, and you're not having people go down the escalator. So you're not getting people going from hardcore fanatic, where they're watching every game, to watching occasionally. Because the thing, this is this is where a lot of things have happened. Like, people that were hardcore rugby fans. You had people going to every game. You had people going to at least a few games a year. But now it's got to the point where a lot of fans are only, that were the hardcore fans, are now only going occasionally when they used to go to every game. And the fans that would go maybe to the majority of games may only go to 1 or 2 games a year, and then people that would go to would go occasionally, either only going to 1 or 2 if they go at all, and people that used to watch, when they didn't go to game, they used to watch all the other games on TV. A lot of them are now only watching occasionally. Less people are watching, and that's because Rugby Australia has just mistreated their fans so badly. And you know, this is why so many people are leaving. You know, there's a current major NRL star, which will, you know, remain nameless for this. He was a big rugby star at school. He was in the Australian schoolboys rugby. He's now playing in the NRL. He had an NRL contract on the table, and he was like, okay, I'll just see what Rugby Australia's offer is. I want to, you know, weigh up my options. I want to see it around. And they said to him, mate, we won't even look into you until you're at least 23. You had to play Shoot Shield. And then he was like, fuck off. Like, no, I'm not going to wait around for 5 years post-school on maybe when I've got an NRL contract in my hand. I'm going to go to the NRL. And that's exactly what he did. And now he's, you know, going from strength to strength and in the NRL. And it's just like, you know, these are the kind of players you can't be losing. Like, you know, they don't sign them up and they just keep going. They keep losing. You might keep the occasional one, but the occasional one that they keep, they just screw up. Like, for a classic example, in my opinion, is Jordan Prataya. Now, I know he's still playing for the Queensland Reds, and he's still playing for the Wallabies, but they're fucking over his career, like, royally, in my opinion. He should be, like, his ability, is, on ability, one of the best players Australia's produced in 20 years. Like, and that's not an exaggeration. I honestly think he's one of the best, you know, blokes on ability in Australian rugby, especially, like, particularly in the backs that they've had since they had the good teams at the late 90s, early 2000s. And they've, you know, but what they keep doing is, you know, this week they're saying, oh, you're a centre. The next week you're a winger. Next week you're a fullback. The next week you're back to a winger. The next week you're back to fullback. The week after that you're back to being a centre. Then after that you're back to, you know, they keep chopping. It's like, this is what I was saying with Dave Rennie, like chopping and changing players every week. But they're also chopping and changing the bloody positions. Like, a bloke just keeps going like, well, you know, what do you want me to do? Like, the thing is, like, players just want to say, okay, what job do you want me to perform? Okay, if you want me to play in the second row, I know you want me to jump in the line out, you know, compete at the line out, you want me to make a nuisance of myself, yada yada, you know, make the occasional steal at the rock, be a strong ball carrier. That's the kind of thing that you want in the second row. You know, if you're an open side funky, you want them over the ball. At 5'8", you want to be the ball playing. But if you keep changing a bloke every position, you're just like, well, do you want me to be a drawn pass? Do you want me a guy that, you know, kicks a bit? Like, what? And I don't think Rugby Australia has really got an idea for him. Like, if he was in New Zealand or if he was in South Africa, they'd be saying, you're an outside centre, you're 13, and this is what the game, that they would have a plan for him, right? They would just say, you're doing A, B, and C. And that's all we want you to do. That's how we want you to play. But rugby just go, oh, well, this week we want you to do this. Next week we wanted you to... And you can just say he's... You know, I know he's never going to admit this, but you can see it all. It's written all... And I think that's why he's getting hurt. Because it's just like because he keeps having to change everything from week to week. He... you know... Because he keeps having to change his lines, do different things, I think there's a lot of strain on his body. And, you know, obviously, you know, a doctor would be able to explain it better. And, you know, I could be just, you know, his body could just be, you know, one of the unfortunate blokes that, you know, has a shitload of ability. Like, well, you know, as an out and out freak of ability, he's got more talent in his little finger than 99.9% of blokes have in the whole bloody body. But unfortunately always gets injured. He could be just one of those blokes that does. And it could be just unfortunate. But I just think they need to lock him down somehow. Like, just say, this is what we want you to do. Because, personally, I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up leaving eventually. Like, I wouldn't honestly be surprised if, either rugby league comes knocking or rugby somewhere in either Japan or Europe. They say, we're going to offer you, 200 grand more than what you're getting paid in Australia. Can't play over here because, he's getting frustrated. And those are the blokes that a rugby can't afford to lose. And, and saying to a bloke who's, I'd assume, they knew that rugby league would have been chasing, we're not even going to consider you until you're 23. Like, bloke, they're just going to leave. And another problem they have is there's no kind of in between, right? Like, for example, and a lot of people, I know a lot of past players are saying it's not the way forward. But the way I see it, they keep saying, academies are not the way forward. Then you need to have players in the shoot shield. Well, okay, let's just use that. Let's say players are in the academy system. If they say you want to have a shoot shield, okay, let's have them in the academy, but let's have the academy having them go through shoot shield or whatever the competitions are in other states, because that's the way to do it. Like, you have some of the best players, rugby players, and that's where you can keep your players. Put it as a reserve grade, with the league, they have the reserve grade where a guy can earn, 20,000, 30 to 30 grand a year, 40 grand a year, playing, lower grades, reserve grade. They're able to study, blah, blah, blah. And then once they get to, 20, 21, 22, they see if they're good enough, and if they are, they sign them on. And they go, they've got, playing in the lower grades for 2 or 3 years. They've got that experience where they're hardened up against the men, and then they push into the Super Rugby. They push into the NRL. And that's similar to what New Zealand does, and that's similar to what South Africa does in the rugby. Like, New Zealand has the NPC, South Africa has the Currie Cup, and that's why it works for them. Like, you occasionally get the occasional freak who, is, someone like Geordie Barrett or something, who's an out and out gun at 18, and who's, built the size of a, already filled out a little bit at 18, and they're just good enough at that age where they can go in. But there's very few players, they only come around once every, handful of years. And majority of players, you need to have the development there. And the problem that rugby has is that they don't have that rugby union has. They don't have that in between. Like, they're relying too much on the grade system, where they're playing with blokes that are either semi-professional or don't really have they don't have a will to go on. Like, they just, they're happy to go to training, 2 or 3 nights a week, week after, they have the career 3 today, go to training, 3 days a week, and then, play on the Saturday, where they have no aspirations to play, professional rugby. Like, as much as they might, be good enough to play Super Rugby, not a lot of these blokes are not willing. They don't want to be a professional footballer, and they're stunting these blokes. So they're playing first grade, and they might be blocking these blokes that are, coming up. And because of internal club politics, that guy might be 32 and played with a club for 10 years and is a club legend, and he's blocking a bloke who could be potentially one of the best players, and then that guy ends up losing interest and either stops playing rugby altogether or he goes to league. And, that's where rugby is really falling down. And they're losing I think one of the big things there also is just mentioning the clubs. They're losing the clubs. Like, everyone I speak to at local clubs, they go, we love rugby union, we love being involved with local clubs, being around the community, but we hate Rugby Australia. The clubs, they've tried to get linked back with the club saying, we're gonna, you can buy $20 tickets and $5 off that ticket goes back to your local club if you use the code, yada yada yada. But a lot of the blokes were like, I know a lot of blokes that just go, we do not want anything to do with Rugby Australia. I wouldn't give a damn if the tickets were bloody $5 and the whole money, all $5 goes to the club. I wouldn't go just simply because that gives a perception of me helping Rugby Australia, and they are that angry with them because they just have mistreated the clubs, and there's where using the analogy earlier, using the escalator analogy again. Here's a bloke that's at the top of the, there's a lot of blokes that are at the top of the escalator, in terms of rugby. Like, they're hardcore fanatical fans, always involved with clubs. They go down every Saturday or every second Saturday, watching them. They watch it on, Stan Sport, or if it's a Shoot Shield, or they watch it on, Clutch TV if it's subbies, and, so they're hardcore fans. But they don't watch the Super Rugby. They're at the bottom of the escalator. Like, they're not on the escalator. So, how they change. I think the way that rugby can change this is they have a fundamental plan. I went to Waverley College, right, which is a rugby nursery. Up until, and they virtually never had anyone there. It's just like, this is a school that's had, I think, the third most amount of Wallabies out of any school in New South Wales. I think the only two in New South Wales that have had more are Kings and Joey's, St Joseph's College, Hunters Hill. There was a test match last year where there were 3 Waverley old boys in the bloody Wallabies team. There was Jed Holloway, Sam Talakai, and Ben Donaldson. Like, there's 3 blokes. There was other blokes that, a guy that I know very well, Ben O'Donnell, he was in my year at Waverley. He plays for the Brumbies now. Like, there's also Ben Donaldson, who plays for the Waratahs. Like, these are the kind of guys that they should be saying, get down to the bloody schools, go down to your old school, play there, not play there, coach there, see any potential talent, and get back to us. Because we want to keep them. Like, even if they say, these guys end up playing sevens. Like, there's a couple of guys in there's a guy, Henry Patterson, Australian sevens player. Where did he go? Waverley College. Like, these are the kind of guys that the school, Rugby Australia should be saying, okay, even if they say you're going, they become sevens players, we can get money out of it. The Sydney Sevens is on at the moment. People will go to that, and that's where they need to really think long and hard about, their long-term strategy, because you want to keep, and keep the guy. First of all, they need to keep the guys that, the schools that are already there, and then once they've settled those schools, then go into start moving it out. Start moving it into more public schools, because that's the major problem. They've lost a lot of the public schools out west. If they use and even in a traditional, union area in the eastern suburbs, get the public schools to play union, then all of a sudden you have a bigger player base, and once you get a bigger player base, you'll get a bigger fan base. Then once you get bigger fan base, you get better players at the elite level, and Australia will be eventually able to get back to what it was over 20 years ago, where they were able to compete against a lot of the best nations in the world, and they can beat them. And once they do that, I think they will be able to compete. But until then, they won't be able to. They'll be just, they'll be just, floundering while everyone else just, runs on past, and Australia will just continue go down the rankings. And the way that they are honestly going, people will laugh at this now. Like, people will laugh. But if they keep going the way they are, they're going to be playing in qualifiers for the Rugby World Cup. Like, if you said that bloody even 5 years ago about Australia, people would have laughed in your face. And a lot of people probably now would probably laugh in my face for saying that. But that's, like, more and more people are literally thinking that now. Like, I've spoken to several people that think along those lines. I originally, when I first saw it, heard it, I thought, well, that's a bit extreme. That's, that, I think that's a bit, how you going? Like, Australian rugby's not doing well, but, they're not doing that badly. And then as time has gone on, I'm just like, shoot, I can see Australia doing that. And, and then if the Australian rugby does that, that's when that's when Rugby Australia is going to die, because I think that's when, unless they all change the management, they will not get to where it is. If they don't want to be playing against countries like bloody Sweden and Denmark and Germany and Spain in qualifiers, where they'll be admittedly winning fairly comfortably, they'll be winning 70 and 80-0, but do they want to be playing those guys? Well, no one would want to watch it. If they want to avoid that fate, get back into the schools, start pushing the juniors, and that's when that's when you will see the national team start improving. Because personally, that's why I think the Australian team is losing, simply because the Rugby Australia has not performed, not being able to keep juniors. Because until they are able to keep their best juniors, they will not. It won't matter who the coach is, because the coach will not have good enough talent. Like, they will not have the depth, I should say. They're always going to have, personally, I think they're always going to have a strong first 23. They should have a strong first 23. But if they get, any of these top 23 get injured, that's when they're going to start struggling to be able to compete with the top countries like New Zealand, South Africa, England, France, Ireland. They'll be losing more than they win, and it won't matter who the head coach is, because as the old expression goes, you can't polish a turd. You can't, if you got shit to deal with, it could be the best shit in the world, but it's still shit. So that's where I think they need to go. Okay, restructure. Let's have a bloody, because I know Gus Gould in the NRL. A lot of people give him laughing at him with. I know I'm cross-coding here, but a lot of people laugh at him with his 5-year plan at Penrith that took 9 years, and they eventually won a premiership after he left. But their plan is going to be a lot longer than 5 years. They need a 15-year. They really need a 15. Because the thing is, they try to go. Everyone's going to come to us. We've got the Rugby World Cup and the Alliance, so everyone's going to come to us. I can tell you that's not going to happen, and they're going to blow the bloody World Cup bid. All the momentum that they should be getting from that, they're going to just waste it. And personally, what they should be doing is implementing a 15-year plan now. Put it in from this year, where they're saying we're going to invest in. Okay, they need to originally start in places that have a traditional rugby foothold, whether it's league or union. Have it where people are originally people that will play either or. So started in basically basically just south of Sydney, north to, and then go work north all the way through, north, go past Sydney, obviously implement a big plan in Sydney, but then obviously all up the rest of New South Wales, right up into Queensland, go to Brisbane, go through the Gold Coast, Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, Toowoomba, go right up, have a plan in Rockhampton, go right up North Queensland, Cairns, Townsville, all up in that area. Implement rugby academies, put a lot of money in there, and that way that you can poach some of those kids. Even though I know up in Central and North Queensland they all play rugby league. Well, get some of those kids to play rugby union. They already have a rugby. They are already preconceived to rugby. Get them play rugby union instead of rugby league. And then it'll take time, but eventually you're going to see some of those kids be able to play. They want to play union, and then you have some teams play in. And then once you see the fruits of that, maybe in 6 or 7 or 8 years, you have your foundations, and they're just starting to take root and that. Then move into areas where don't have the traditional rugby background, but even if where you have teams, Melbourne, Tasmania, Perth. As much as Tasmania doesn't have a team, you have teams in Perth, you have a Super Rugby team in Melbourne. Put big rugby academies there. Give some kind of incentive to schools for them to play rugby union instead of AFL. And then, yes, I know you're going against 100 years, 120, 130 years of history where, these places have always played AFL. But, look what AFL's done in Sydney. Back when the Swans first came to Sydney 40 years ago, other than people that were, there was no Sydney-siders that watched them. All the people that watched them were from the other states, or they're either from, they're originally from, they're either the first generation Sydney-siders where all of their family was from Victoria, other states, like Victoria, South Australia, WA, so they watched a bit of AFL anyway, or they were from those areas to begin with. No one from Sydney watched the Swans, when they first came to Sydney in the 80s. It was, literally no one watched them. It was all rugby league, rugby union back then. And now, a lot of Sydney-siders still don't watch them, but, they've got a very strong fan base now. They've got, every year, they're getting people on the escalator, right? Even if they're at the bottom of that escalator, they've got, people that at least, watch them in the finals. Bare minimum, they watch them in the finals at least. So at least they've got a few people watching. That's what rugby needs. Just get a few people watching then, and I know this one's been around for 40 years, and they're like, well, that's a long time. But that's what they need. They can't just go, oh, we want to, plan that will come off in 3 years. You need to go, well, we want to be around in 10 years, we want to be around in 15, we want to be around in 25, we want to be around in 40 years' time. And that's when you eventually, and obviously it's going to take at least one generation. But eventually you're going to get there, and then eventually you'll see it grow, you'll see it prosper, and that's when you get all these, you'll get at least some players there, and then you'll eventually see, well, we've succeeded. We're getting Victorian players now playing for the Wallabies. We're getting more we're getting better players in Western Australia. Like, we've already got, some kind of foothold there, but now we're getting more. And that's what they want. And then you become a lot stronger, and, eventually, Australia will get back to where it was, and maybe even stronger than what they were in the late 90s, early 2000s. It took one generation for Australia to get, go down the shitter. Hopefully it could take it might take one, maybe even 2 generations before rugby is back to an elite level where they're dominating and being competitive again. But if that's what it takes, that's what it takes, and that's where rugby really needs to think about it long term. What I would like to know is what you think about this. Whether you think my plans are radical, if you think Dave Rennie was hard done by. Do you think he should have stayed coach? Do you think it was the right decision? Do you think Eddie Jones was a right or wrong decision? What do you think about Rugby Australia? I'm interested to know what you think. Everyone's different. Got different opinions. So, whatever your thoughts are, let me know, because I'm always interested to know what your ideas are. Until next time, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.